Good evening and welcome to the January 26th, 2022 Planning and Zoning Commission meeting. You can join our meeting tonight. This will be our last meeting in person at this location, but you can join by joining Cedar. You can watch on Cedar Falls Utilities Channel 15. You can by phone and internet, and all those instructions are online. With that, we'll call the meeting to order and have a roll call vote.
Chrisman? Here. Gribovich? Here. Hartley?
Here.
Holst?
Here.
Larson? Leeper?
Here.
Lynch? Here. Moser? Here. Saul?
Here.
All right, we have a quorum. So with that, we'll call the meeting to order, and we'll have, I would entertain a motion to approve the December 22nd, 2021 meeting minutes.
So moved.
Second.
So moved and seconded. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
All right,
Aye.
thank you, Leanne. Minutes are approved. Now's the time for public comments. If there's anyone that would like to make public comments on items that are not on the agenda, you can come forward, or if there's anyone online, you can raise your hand online.
We have no attendees.
All right, no attendees online, so we will move forward. We have no old business tonight, and we have a couple of new business items. And Karen, you're going to kick these off together, is that right?
Yeah, I'll just go through, and we have 3 new planning and zoning commissioners since the Downtown Character District Code was adopted last November. And so I will go kind of over what the petition from City Council is regarding the Downtown Character District, and then we can discuss the items. So to kick it off, there's a petition from the City Council. They discussed at their last meeting to amend the parking requirements in the recently adopted Downtown Character District. The petition specifically, they asked to delete the requirements for shared parking, and then to consider increasing the minimum parking requirement for residential development to 1 space per bedroom. If that's not increased, they also discussed wanting to ensure that there's at least 1 parking space per residential unit. So just a little background for those new on the commission and for anybody watching online. This is the boundary of the Downtown Character District. You can see that it includes the downtown core, and then of course the neighborhoods to the west and to the south down to 18th Street. The boundary was drawn based on the previous zoning districts that were all the higher density older zones in the city that surrounded downtown. It did not include any R1 and only 1 block of R2 was included. So all R3, R4, C1, C2, C3, there was some manufacturing zone downtown, and then of course the downtown overlay zone was there previously. So this all then was adopted and changed to the Downtown Character District. There's a new code, and then all the property in the area was rezoned to Downtown Character District. So I'm not going to go through this whole thing, but just to remind, and I'm sure the Planning and Zoning Commission remembers the whole process, but it was a long public review process. The code was drafted by Community Recode and Farrell Madden, and there was extensive internal staff review and trying to look and making sure that what we're trying to do was implement the downtown vision plan that was adopted by council in November 2019 after quite a long process of public outreach in the downtown area. So there's also preparing for the review and adoption process, because this was a big code change. We went over how we were going to conduct the public review process with the Planning and Zoning Commission, with Community Main Street Board, and with the council, and reviewed how we wanted to lay out the whole review process before we even started. Then in February, the new draft code was rolled out at a special meeting of the Planning and Zoning Commission after much public outreach and notice. The commission then held 4 different work sessions, separate work sessions There were also a work session at Community Main Street, and there were 3 work sessions offered to development professionals in the community. And then there were formal P&Z hearings in March and April, 3 formal public hearings. And then P&Z made a recommendation to council in May of 2021. Council then, there was a presentation to the council of P&Z's recommended draft on May 17th. And then council held several work sessions in June and August to talk about the review process, the decisions that the P&Z made, what the proposals were, and there was a specific focus on the parking requirements in the downtown code that were proposed. So quite a bit of discussion on the parking requirements, and then there was a committee of the whole meeting focused just on shared parking and what that meant and what the implications were. And then the public hearing was on September 7th, and the council took the first vote on the new ordinance and rezoning all the properties. Then the council stepped back, had another committee of the whole meeting to discuss more about parking, and then took the second vote on the ordinance October 18th, and in November, then was the final vote in adoption of the Character District Code and the rezoning of the properties. So just a little recap of the policies and regulations in downtown. Just kind of a reminder of, how parking kind of is generally done in downtown areas. And just want to draw attention to, there's really 2 types of parking in a downtown area. You've got the public parking and you've got the private parking. The public parking is located, of course, on public property. So it includes the on-street parking spaces, the parking lots, the public lots, and if there's any public parking ramps, it also includes those. It's often thought of as the most efficient because it can be shared by everyone and any use as demand for parking fluctuates in downtown over the course of a day. Therefore, there's less parking needed overall to serve all the needs of, a compact downtown like Cedar Falls. Private parking, on the other hand, is located on private property. That is what the zoning code addresses, is what are the parking requirements on private property. So sometimes people get mixed up between the two, so we're not really talking about public parking ramps or anything like that, public policies. On public parking, we're talking about should there be parking requirements on private property in a downtown area. So generally, property owners decide how much parking they need to serve their development. And cities sometimes also dictate in the zoning ordinance a minimum parking requirement for certain land uses. And I say sometimes because there's quite a few cities, including quite a few around the country, that have stepped back over the last couple decades and either reduced or eliminated the parking requirements in a downtown setting because it's so inefficient and it's a waste of valuable downtown land. So a lot of cities, including a number in Iowa, have ratcheted down their parking requirements in the downtown area, or in some cases even eliminated minimum parking requirements in the code. Now that doesn't necessarily mean that private property owners are not providing any parking. What it means is that the government is not dictating how much parking is required. Then it leaves it open for the private market to determine how much parking. The private property owner really knows a lot about how much parking they expect to need for their business. The private parking is not generally shared with others, so it does sit vacant when the business is not open. So here's a little interesting kind of chart to demonstrate kind of why cities are going away from focusing just on zoning requirements for parking and more toward public shared parking, because it's much more efficient. You can see how if you have unshared parking, each use has its own parking requirements. And you can see how much parking then every separate use of a building has. Residential, office, has a restaurant on the first floor, and each one has parking requirements. Then on that particular site, they've got to provide all these requirements, even though, for example, the office use may not be using their parking in the evening when the restaurant use is at its peak. So you can see if you have shared public parking, how those peaks and valleys of demand really will result in the need for less parking and still cover all the needs of a downtown area. There's another distinction, I think, to keep in mind, and that is the difference between short-term parking needs and long-term parking needs. So short-term parking needs are generally thought of as being customer parking for businesses. So this is often best satisfied through public parking to meet the parking demand for different uses throughout the day, just as I mentioned. So for quick trips, on-street parking is often the most convenient, and for longer shopping or dining trips, people often rely on the public lots or parking ramps where they can park for longer periods of time. That same parking can be used for both daytime customers and for evening customers, so it can fluctuate throughout the day and serve all those needs. Long-term parking needs in a downtown are really about, employees or owners of businesses that are downtown all day and need a parking space. And then for downtown residents, they need some, a lot of people need a parking space. Some people don't have a car, but a lot of people still do. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking long-term parking needs. So this is often best satisfied through, say, for example, parking permits in a public lot. So you purchase a permit so you can park your car on a long-term basis in a parking lot or a ramp, or you have dedicated parking on a particular site where your apartment or condo is located. And that's dedicated, and often then you reserve it when you rent or own a condo. So why cities rely on public parking rather than private parking for a lot of the needs in a downtown area? And that's because downtowns are different. In Cedar Falls, we have a walkable Main Street. You often do multiple activities. You drive down once, park, and do multiple activities on a trip. You park once and walk. There's a lot of unique shops and restaurants that are in a very compact area, which makes it much more walkable and pleasant. And then, of course, there's special events downtown that often lend itself to having, public parking provided for those special events. And then, of course, urban living, people living downtown, and the need to separate, kind of what we're thinking about private parking and public parking. So some of the unintended consequences of high parking requirements and why some cities around the country are really rethinking having such high parking requirements in the zoning code. It stunts the growth of downtown. It shifts development to outlying areas where land is less costly. The cost of parking is passed down. If you require too much parking, it's passed down to businesses, customers, and residents, which results in increased commercial lease rates and higher residential rents in a downtown area. And then keeping in mind that unused parking generates no revenue and no tax base. It's basically unusable during times when it's not being used. Donald Shoup, one of the gurus about parking, in his book, Parking in the City, estimates that parking requirements increase the rent households pay for their apartments by 13%. So what about Cedar Falls? There's a lot of question about how much parking should we require in Cedar Falls, what's going on with the parking demand at different times of day. So the city hired a consultant at the direction of City Council to study the parking demand in downtown Cedar Falls. And I put this slide up here. This is directly from the parking study. So they went directly out. It wasn't just anecdotal or asking people about it. It really was counting cars at different times of day. And they tried to find times when there was peak parking demand downtown. So this was the slide from the peak parking demand that they found while they were here on a number of different days. This was a Friday night on Halloween weekend. So the on-street parking you can see here was at 90%, and the public surface lots were at 89%, so effectively full. But you can see here on this slide that the private surface lots were only, and that was amounted to 172 open spaces, were only 52% full. So all that private parking that was locked up in those private lots couldn't be used during that peak time for all these customers that were coming downtown. So what the parking study said was the underutilization of private off-street parking in the evenings after 5 has been documented in every data collection count that they did. This condition underscores the fact that parking exempt districts are good public policy for downtown urban centers, and that requiring individual land uses to create their own on-site parking is bad public policy. Basically, when individual land uses are required to create their own on-site parking based on old parking ratios that were developed, decades ago, the typical result is an oversupply of private parking that is not shared then with other users. So the parking study really took a multi-pronged approach to downtown parking and basically had a number of different recommendations, both for public parking and for the private parking. So basically, most of it focused on the public parking. So improve the management of the public lots, both on-street and the city lots. And then try to unlock some of that existing underutilized private parking lots during the peak evening hours when it really was the big parking crunch. So for example, the previous mayor worked on a public-private agreement with Viking Pump to share their parking lot during the evening hours when the restaurants were most busy. And if you come downtown today, you can park in the Viking Pump lot, after hours. That was a negotiated shared parking agreement and was voluntary. And then another recommendation of the parking study was to right-size the parking requirements in the zoning code. Just as they perpetuate underutilized private parking lots, and so we don't want to perpetuate that practice. So that was the recommendation. And then plan for additional public parking to support growth. And I think that's also going on. City Council is considering, moving forward with studying a parking facility, considering ways to provide more public parking for customers downtown, particularly as the downtown grows. So focus tonight is on, of course, the zoning code, and council has requested that P&Z consider a number of things, eliminating the shared parking requirement in the new code. They have heard concerns about requiring private property owners to share their parking with the public. Some believe that any sharing should be voluntary and not required. There's quite a bit of discussion about shared parking and really whether it was a good thing to do or not. And then increasing the parking requirements for residential, back to 1 space per bedroom. And then just a note, if P&Z does not recommend increasing the parking requirements, then a note to ensure that there's at least 1 parking space per unit. And that was a concern about, well, what if the building is all studio apartments or all 1-bedroom apartments? If the requirement is less than 1 space per bedroom, then you wouldn't have at least one space per unit, which people found this to be problematic. So just a reminder of what was previously required in the downtown area. In the Central Business District overlay, no parking was required for commercial uses. Residential uses were often negotiated with City Council, but it became practice that it was 1 space per bedroom was required, with on-street parking counted toward a visitor parking requirement that was in the code. And then outside the Central Business District, the requirement was 2 spaces per unit for a single-family house. If it was rent or occupied, then there was an additional space for each bedroom in excess of 2. And then for multifamily, it was also 2 per unit plus 1 for each bedroom, and beyond 2. And then there was also a visitor parking requirement of 1 space for every 5 residential units. So that's what the parking requirements were previously in the downtown area. In the new code, as you recall, there was the general urban 2, and storefront frontages were the downtown core, basically. And we basically kept the parking exemptions the same as they were before. And that was was concerns about allowing adaptive reuse of existing buildings downtown, wanting to foster that. Really kept those exemptions the same. I just want to note that council has not suggested any changes to these exemptions. So for residential and mixed use or multi-unit buildings, the parking requirement in the new code is 0.5 spaces per bedroom, half a space per bedroom, which means, if you have a 2-bedroom apartment, it means you have 1 parking space for that 2-bedroom. And then there's an additional 0.25 spaces per bedroom in shared parking requirements. So what that means is it must be available for public to park in it for at least 12 hours per day. And I'll go into a little bit more about what shared parking is in a moment, just in case the new members are not kind of up to speed on what that is. For single units, it did reduce it down to 1 per unit instead of 2, and then add a parking space for rental properties for each bedroom beyond 2. There is no shared parking for single unit, things like row houses and single family houses. And then with regard to shared parking, there was a concern expressed about what if there's new office uses and that sort of thing in mixed use buildings downtown, shouldn't additional parking be required? So in the new code, there is a shared parking requirement for commercial uses on upper floors, and this is all in new buildings. So we're just talking about new buildings. So if the use is less than 5,000 square feet, there's no parking required. If they're larger than 5,000 square feet, then there's a shared parking requirement of 1.25 spaces per 1,000 square feet. And that can be used by the employees or the business, but at least 12 hours of the day, then it must be shared with the public. And let's see. In the neighborhood frontages, the parking requirement was still lowered a little bit from what it was previously, but higher than the downtown core. So basically 0.75 spaces per bedroom, and then basically the same parking requirement for single unit and duplexes, row houses, that sort of thing. And then there were a few grandfathered office uses in some of the areas, and those had the same parking requirements they had before. There was a minimum shared parking requirement in the new code for residential in multi-unit buildings of 0.25 spaces per bedroom. So what is shared parking? Shared parking is automobile parking that is accessible to the public at least 12 hours a day out of a 24-hour period, designated by appropriate signage and markings on site or within 600 feet walking distance. The shared parking requirement would not obligate owners to give up any percentage of their parking. The goal is to maximize the usage of any new parking by making a small percentage of it available for some portion of the day, most typically when it is not needed by the property owners, their tenants, or employees. So for example, parking for an office might be full use from 8 to 6 p.m. on Monday to Friday, but would sit empty most evenings and weekends. So the goal is to make some portion of that parking available to others during those times. Similarly, on the opposite end of the spectrum, the shared parking for residential, occupied by residents most evenings and weekends, but some of it might sit empty during weekdays. Now, it's been mentioned that some people work from home, of course, but the idea is there's only a small portion of it that's required to be shared. So a portion of that parking would then be made available during the hours when the residents weren't using it. In either scenario, the owners can maintain a percentage of their parking as reserved at all times to meet their needs. So it's the owner of the property that gets to decide how they want to share it and how they want to set up their sharing to meet the requirement. So a few things to keep in mind. The parking requirements proposed in the downtown zoning code are for new development. There's no changes required for existing development. Existing properties do not have to share their parking. That was kind of a misunderstanding. I think hopefully we've said that enough that people understand that that's not the case. City-owned public parking lots are not affected by the new code. There is a separate effort, as I said, to increase the amount of public parking downtown. Shared parking will add to the available parking during peak times. Some have expressed a concern about requiring private property owners to share their parking with the public. And those folks have noted that it still can be voluntarily shared. Developers or property owners of new development do not have to give up their property for shared parking. It only has to be made available when they're not using it. And then finally, parking requirements in the zoning code are minimums. Just because they're lower doesn't mean somebody could decide they need more parking than what the city requires and provide that parking with their project. One good example recently is the Community Bank and Trust built a new branch bank downtown recently. There was no requirement at all for any commercial parking for their property, and yet they put in the parking that they knew that they needed for their customers and for their employees. So just keep in mind that just because it's not in the zoning code or it's not required, doesn't mean that somebody can't provide more parking than to suit their needs. So for tonight, our staff recommendation is to discuss the council's request to eliminate the shared parking requirements in the zoning code and set a public hearing for your February 9th meeting. And also to discuss council's request to increase the residential parking requirement back to 1 space per bedroom for new mixed-use and multi-unit buildings, and then set a public hearing for that discussion for February 9th. And I'd be happy to entertain any questions or just open up for discussion.
Thank you, Karen. That's for the new commission members. You just covered 2 years of material. So thank you, Karen. That was well done. Before we have discussion, I'd like to open up to the public if there's any comments. No one online, so we'll bring it back to the commission for discussion. Again, this item is to open a public hearing for the February 9th meeting, but we're really giving feedback to Karen so that we can do something on that moving forward here.
Why don't we start with a motion to schedule the public hearing? I'll open with that motion.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. Any discussion?
Question, Karen. On an existing building, with apartments, that they're required to have 1 parking stall per bedroom, and that doesn't change, right, in the new zoning?
Oh, any existing?
Yeah, so existing conditions, how is the parking requirement handled for them? Since when they were put in, they were required to have 1 per bedroom.
Right. Well, assuming that they have 1 per bedroom that they constructed basically with the project, those would continue to be available, I'm assuming,
Well,
but,
still required to be in existence, right? I mean,
so,
the zoning ordinance then retroactively, that was the one thing the question I guess I
Okay.
thought of was that, I don't know that I ever.
So that's a good question. So anytime the zoning code changes and the requirements change, anybody that's got existing property, the requirements change as well. So while you already have the parking requirements that you required previously, if you change your property or change uses of your property, you would only have to meet the new requirements for those changes.
Well, how would that work then? Because they wouldn't have any shared parking requirement now. Say I decide, okay, I've got, a 4-bedroom thing and I want to, I'm going to take 2 of those parking stalls out, but I don't require to have any more to do whatever, in the back of my building. Are they then required to provide some shared parking under that scenario?
So nothing new. If you haven't changed anything on your property, you don't have to you don't have to comply with any new requirement,
Well, what
right?
I'm saying is, okay, well, if they want to get rid of some of that parking, they can do it.
Right, but assuming that they were gonna do something with that piece of ground, in other words, if you've got parking spaces and somebody wanted to propose building more on their parking, say they've got,
They want to put a storage area on the back of the
right,
thing on the main.
right. We'd take a look and make sure that they met the new requirements. So in that sense, we would look and say, okay, you've got this much parking on your lot, and these are the new requirements.
Well, they would have to have, for instance, with 4, they would have to have 2, but then they would still have, they would owe a half, so we would probably round that to 1, and so you basically,
Yeah.
you have to have 3 parking
Right,
stalls, because
right.
you have to have one of those has to be shared.
Right, so it only is triggered when there's a change proposed to the property, and then we would look at what is the change that they're proposing to do, and that is the same anywhere across the city now. If somebody comes in and wants to change their property, we always look at the current parking requirements and say, okay, well, you can change it in this way, or you can add a shed, or you can add, an addition on your building, but we're gonna make sure you meet the current parking requirements.
Okay, I just
Yeah.
wanted to clarify that understanding.
Right.
Because there is a fair amount of development already in downtown, and so, and the changes are happening all the time to that, so that, it does become a factor.
Right,
when
right, yeah.
All right, Karen, we have a motion in a second, but we should have all of our discussion before we vote. Is that, that's
Right.
proper, right? So let's have discussion on it.
As maybe a refresher for anybody kind of new to some of this discussion, I thought it might be helpful to clarify some of the things that that would trigger or constitute new development as to when this shared parking requirement would actually be applicable, because I feel like there's a lot of misunderstanding as to how widespread this requirement would be reaching, and what specific scenarios where that would apply to new development.
Sure. So the only shared parking requirement is for new residential units. So if you're adding residential units to your property in a multi-unit building or a mixed-use building, so not building a single-family house or, a duplex or something like that. It has to be, it's only required for new mixed-use buildings that have residential units and for a multifamily building that has residential units. Or if you're building a brand-new building that has upper floor commercial space that's greater than 5,000 square feet, then there is that shared parking requirement for that new building for upper floor for commercial.
So if a building were being remodeled and the bedroom count were not to change, then there would be no change to the parking requirements, even though the requirements would have changed.
That's correct.
Right, okay. Another thing, as far as the requirements are concerned for shared parking, and this is just kind of a clarification and a refresher for everyone. What, when we're talking about the shared parking uses, as the owner of the building would be providing for and a portion, what are the metrics for deciding what that portion of shared parking is, and how much of it the owner is required to part with or not? I think it'd be helpful to shed some specifics on how that would work, or maybe some examples.
So, for example, the residential parking requirement is 0.25 spaces per bedroom. So, assuming that they were providing all their parking on site to build the new building, they would have a required parking requirement for the residential of 0.5 spaces per bedroom, plus they'd have the 0.25 spaces. So effectively 0.75 spaces per bedroom would have to be provided by the developer. 0.25 spaces per of that has to be made available as shared parking for at least 12 hours a day. Now they could, and a portion of that has to be during, regular business hours. So, during times when it would necessarily be used by the public. So it can't be all just in the middle of the night at 2 a.m. or something like that. So they would come in, when they're going through their site plan review process, and that developer would identify, okay, well, I've got, most of my building is residential, and so these, 5 spaces, I'm gonna make these available as shared parking during the day. And I'm gonna put a sign up that says these are publicly available, and then during a certain number of hours. So it just sign it to say, during these hours, the public can park here.
So in other words, there are clear metrics as to what those requirements are and when they apply. And as we've heard, they do not apply to existing properties and to existing property owners. I feel like a lot of the contention about the parking matter is not entirely in context as this is applying to new projects. I'm aware of some of the feedback and some of the points that have been made, liability and so on and so forth about parking. Has there been some specific feedbacks from developers about potential new projects that have any concerns about the shared parking requirements?
Well, of course, the new code has only been in effect since November, and we haven't had a lot of, testing of the ordinance so far, but we have not, there's a couple of projects maybe potentially in the works. We have not heard any concerns from developers about the requirements.
Karen, I have a question on, these numbers get a little, right? I mean, what do they mean?
Yeah.
I think is the question for some people. And so I would just like some reference for people. The State Street project, for example, is probably the largest project that's been developed recently. And the parking is basically at a 1-to-1 ratio on that project. Is
Right.
that
That's correct.
correct?
I wasn't here when most of that was built, but I believe that was a part of the development agreement, that they would provide 1 parking space per bedroom for all the units in River Place.
Okay, so I guess, what is the evaluation that's been done we have a real-world example here. The council is asking us to go to to consider the 1 space per unit or per bedroom. We have that example. Do we have any tests of how full those lots are?
Yeah. So, like I said, I put up the parking slide and anybody can look at that parking study, and here's the slide again. So this is during peak times in the evening, so supposedly when most of the residents would be home. It's showing that surface parking lot, you can see here the blue with the red dashed line around it is the River Place parking lot. And during that 7 p.m. on a Friday evening, that lot is only 41 to 60% full. So there's quite a few parking spaces available in that lot.
Clarification on that, Karen, but is that all?
You might
That's not
know.
all necessarily just residential parking, that could be, you're talking, private parking is not all necessarily.
Thank you.
Sorry about that. All private parking is not residential, though, certain amount of that is the required residential parking, and some of it may actually be just private parking, right?
No, the parking on River Place was calculated based on the number of bedrooms.
Specifically to River Place, and that they are only parking residential then.
Right. Now, that doesn't mean that the owner, because they know how many residents they have and how much parking those residents need at any point in time. So there are some commercial tenants on the ground floor of those mixed-use buildings there.
Right.
And I think when there's parking available, they have probably leased or made available some of the empty parking spaces
But the
for,
parking requirement is all just based on the
Residential.
The parking that's there is all based exactly on the residential and no excess.
that's correct.
Okay, yeah.
I have a question. You mentioned earlier that there are many cities that started moving away from this requirement. Have there been any recap, revisiting, lessons learned? How is it working for them? Have they run into any issues? You shared that slide at the beginning that showed the distribution. Is that really where that's coming from?
Yeah, there's an awful lot of literature out there because cities have been lowering their parking requirements for a number of decades. I think a lot of the parking and really the the seminal work on parking demand and came from Donald Shoup. He did an extensive, I think it's like 850-page book of research on parking and demand and how it's affected cities and how they're built. And it was eye-opening to so many places that we have been requiring so much parking that it takes up so much land in our cities, not just in our downtowns, but in a lot of areas. And I know that, for example, we have parking requirements for commercial, of course, in our outlying areas everywhere in town for office and for retail. I know that when, for example, Fleet Farm came in for their site plan with that big site on the south part of town there, and they were surprised at how much parking that Cedar Falls required for. So even a big box retailer like that would not have provided that much parking. And so basically they had to put in more parking than they felt they needed from their corporate office to serve a big box retailer. And so basically that was a lot of cost that was put onto that development site. And that was just one anecdotal situation. I think that has happened across the country is these parking requirements were devised, a bit of a mystery back in the the 50s, 60s, 70s. And a lot of cities found that, hey, they're just really set too high and are really wasting a lot of valuable land in our cities and have caused a lot of problems for redevelopment. For example, Thunder Ridge, I know several years ago someone came in and had an idea about how to reuse some of the Thunder Ridge buildings there, and we all know that some of them are sitting kind of underutilized. But we told them they couldn't do it because they couldn't meet the parking requirements that we had on the books. So it is, something that I think really cities are taking a look at really carefully, and a lot of, Des Moines, Iowa City, Cedar Rapids, Mason City just recently eliminated all parking requirements. And I think the idea is developers and business owners know a lot better about what parking demand they have for their businesses than a government does. And because zoning is so inflexible, over time, it's just not an easy thing to determine what the parking demand is for a particular location for a particular business.
I think that's well said. I think it's hard to argue with the fact that broadly speaking, we very much live in a world of overregulation these days, and I feel like at a glance, this new ordinance could seem like more of that. But looking at it a little bit deeper, and specifically with respect to parking, I feel like it's almost a step the other direction, where it gives freedom with free market conditions in mind to developers and to business owners to make that call for themselves. If there's an over-parking imposition and you want to see the success of that, I think looking at any mall anywhere is a good example of when there's prioritization of parking over density. I think Karen's word of underutilization was putting it pretty gently when we're talking about malls anyway. And if a business wants that kind of setting, there's plenty of real estate opportunity to do so. And if they want a setting where they're in the heart of all of it, parking takes a back seat. While it's a hot button for so many of us, it's a matter of picking one or the other, not both. You can't have your cake and eat it too, to use the old adage. And from what I've seen and understood, and all of my exposure to the discovery process with envisioning and all of that, was that at least by a slight margin, there was public favor for density and intrigue and urban vibrancy for downtown, slightly, even if it is slightly, over parking. And if we want parking instead, then we're kind of going the other direction. As far as the specific metrics and on the bays and all that sort of thing, I feel like we'd have to really open up, as a commission, I feel like we'd really have to open up a can of worms and maybe do a multi-meeting session, especially with so many new members, to get into the specifics that we've already been through so extensively, to really take a fair reassessment if that's necessary. But reaching back to a moment at a previous meeting, I remember speaking about it more from a personal perspective. I don't work downtown. I do not own a business downtown, but I consider myself kind of a regular downtown user. I'm downtown on average probably 2 to 3 times a week, and personally, I don't feel like parking is that big of a problem. I think the draw exceeds the nuisance that parking is. I remember being downtown for dinner, going downtown for dinner, worrying about it on the night of holiday hoopla, and didn't have a problem at all. And on days like the last few days when it's in the negative temperatures, the idea of having to walk a block or two is certainly a nuisance. But if businesses are willing to roll the dice, new businesses are willing to roll the dice on people being willing to do that or not, I think we owe that to them to make those decisions, and them doing so, I think, is evident in the success of the downtown as it's evolved to this point. I think this would be, I think what we put together and what we worked so hard on before, as it was configured, basically supercharges that that trajectory that we've already been blessed with our downtown here. So those are a couple of my 2 bits on it.
It's well said, Kyle.
I,
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead, Leanne.
this is Leanne. And on the shared parking, because it's solely decided upon between the developer and the city, I don't see why shared parking should go away. I just feel it's a better use of all those resources and assets. In terms of the parking ratio, I believe the city council was looking and asking for the 0.75 per bedroom, and then a minimum of 1 per unit. And I guess I would consider that change. I know it's a small change, or it seems like a big change, but it's actually pretty small, and that is something that will satisfy that. I would consider that.
One comment from me. We've been doing this a long time, and I think some of the perception out there is this is an anti-developer kind of move. And I think the exact opposite is true, as Kyle said, and that this is a change. We spent a lot of time talking about parking. And a lot of projects spent a lot of time coming through this commission because of a lack of clarity in that parking and arguing for too much parking. So this is very much a pro-developer kind of move. And so there's a little bit of that misperception out there, I think, in the community right now, that I'm hearing at least. It gets the city out of this thing, and it simplifies these things for developers that we were getting complaints on, and this is a reaction to that. Just my take on a little perspective for those of you that maybe haven't been here for a while.
Can I just ask a few new person questions? So the private parking, those are all lots, correct? So like if someone has a garage within their building, does that count as their private parking, and do they have to share that?
So private parking is just any parking that's provided on a private lot.
Okay, but
So
you
if
have a
it's inside the
garage-
building or underneath the building or in a lot, it's all, private parking.
Okay, so then it has to be shared. They have to offer shared?
Only for that percentage that we're talking about.
Right.
So, for example, if a portion of it's underneath the building, and a portion of it's in the lot, probably the most logical thing for the developer to decide is just to make the parking that's most readily available to the public, be the spots that are offered as shared parking.
Just a clarification for everyone, the areas that we're talking about are not all of the areas covered under the rezoned area for the new ordinance. We're only talking about the immediate downtown core and the abutting urban character districts, correct?
Right.
That's right, although there was a shared parking requirement for new multifamily buildings in the neighborhoods. Now, there's only a limited ability to build multifamily in some of those existing neighborhoods. But if you were proposing a new multifamily building in the neighborhood, there is a 0.25 spaces shared parking requirement. Now, that was put in there because there used to be a visitor parking requirement for multifamily, and I think that was the idea there, is that the on-street parking in front of a building could count toward the shared parking requirement, but if you didn't have any on-street parking, you'd provide some visitor parking on your property at that ratio.
So I guess, as we've gone through this whole process before, I mean, I had a lot of concerns about parking, kind of always have. I'm really, and I didn't think that it was so bad what we had, for one car per bedroom for residential, because my concern is, there's a certain popularity of residential downtown now, and, and that parking then could kind of overwhelm the public realm, if you will, and make it inaccessible, to commercial businesses and things like that. And so that's always been my kind of concerns. We went through the whole thing, but after you kind of try to dissect all the pieces and parts, I mean, we're not, and the point being made that there is a lot of inefficient use of parking downtown. I think if we're going to move forward, I don't know if this will 100% work the way it went through, but it sure sounds like, I kind of came to the conclusion that, if we're going to move forward, we got to do something different than what we've done. And, I think we ought to take a shot at this rather than regressing back to our old ways, because that's certainly not going to change anything. So that's just kind of been my whole, I understand the worries about parking. I worry about it a lot too, but I think, and sometimes it's hard to, change is hard. You got to leap in feet first, and I think we did that. And I think it was the right decision we made before. So that's kind of where I've been left standing.
I'd like to add to that, Marty, a little bit, and not invalidate the parking concerns that are out there, but I think one of the things that's a little bit out of context is we're looking at the small piece of the pie that is future development to solve an already existing problem.
Yeah,
I'm stepping outside of the purview of what we're looking at now and saying that if we're looking at solving a current problem or the perception of a current problem, maybe those solutions are different than the zoning ordinances that we're talking about, things like paid parking requirements or reverting to some of those paid parking requirements. And also the idea of investing in a future parking ramp and some of those things. Those are all awesome infrastructure investments that could further fuel growth and development downtown long-term, and also solve some of the current challenges or the perception of current challenges that we have. But I think strangling what is otherwise a good step forward for development, with the idea that tweaking a couple of numbers is by itself going to fix a problem when it's just a tiny piece of the pie, I think is a little bit, quite simply just a misunderstanding of.
I think you're spot on with that. I mean, I think if we have a parking problem, it's going to have to be a public solution, and it can't be foisted onto the shoulders of the property owners and developers downtown. Most successful, some of the successful downtowns that I've seen, like if you go up to Edina, Minnesota, or like in Park City, Utah, they got really successful little downtown areas, and they all have public parking ramps, that are right tucked right into the center of the thing, and, right off the main drag, so to speak, but you can park there and then you can just walk right out into the middle of everything. And I think, if our downtown's gonna continue to grow the way it's been growing, we're gonna hit that point where, that's gonna be the need. You can't do it privately, I don't think.
In some of those places, the on-street parking might be as much as $20 an hour, and they're full. And so some of those are legislative and regulatory tools that can be used to, to try and keep the needle in the middle a little bit. But, as far as the goals that weren't just ours, but the communities through the visioning process, the ordinance, I think, as we proposed it with those parking metrics as they were, I think, accomplished at that about as well as you could with something that's kind of lofty in a sense, where you again can't have your cake and eat it too.
Karen, one other clarification. People have perceived this as okay, once it's there, it's there. Our previous zoning code was intact for over 50 years. How many changes were made to it over that time?
I think there was quite a few changes made to it over that time, and so it became such a patchwork of various amendments and things. So I think that's one of the reasons the council gave the direction we need to update and replace a lot of that old so that it's more clear. We don't have overlapping regulations that are confusing, and so that was one of the purposes of mounting this whole effort and starting with downtown, because it's such an important part of the community.
Leslie, there's some good information in your presentation. How people in the community get a hold of that?
Of course, this will be made available on YouTube after, you can listen to the presentation on YouTube. It'll be made available.
I think it'd be good to get a couple pieces of information to the commission here, maybe your presentation, and also maybe for the new members, the parking study might be a useful document if they don't have it already.
Right, sure. I'd be happy to forward anything that you would like to look over.
I think that's a good idea. Also, for the hearing or for the next meeting, I think it would be it'd be helpful also, easier for staff to look up anyway than in my notes and recollections anyway. I think it'd be helpful to look at potentially some of those decision matrix documents and some of the specific minutes and conversations that happened where we kind of extensively debated and discussed the actual per bay or per bedroom requirements, the 0.25 and 0.75 and 0.5, all that stuff. Because there's a lot of history there, and obviously new members and kind of a revived conversation publicly that we're having about this. So I think it'd be helpful to just bring some of that detail back into the spotlight.
Yeah, and there were quite a few. I know we had one work session at the commission that was devoted solely to looking at the parking requirements and answering questions about that. But there was a lot more discussion at the city council, and all those presentations, both by Farrell Madden and by myself, over that review period from May until November when the code was adopted. There were quite a few presentations that are still available by video if people would like to look at those for each one of those. And I will forward this presentation, which gives the outline of the dates when those council meetings occurred, and those you can look those videos up if you're interested in kind of listening to the presentations about parking. I tried to condense that. I took slides from each one of those presentations and tried to give an overview here, but there's a lot more information out there about parking. So I'd be happy to provide any information that you would like to have, and I certainly can provide. The parking study is on the city's website. The downtown vision plan is another thing that I think, particularly the new members, if you weren't there when we did the whole visioning process or didn't participate in that. I think that's really important because the downtown code was supposed to be implementing the vision that the community had said they wanted in the downtown area. So I'll make all those links available to you all, and let me know. You can just email me directly if there's something else you think of that you would like information about.
Thank you, Karen. Any other comments? All right, we have a motion and a second to set the public hearing for February 9th. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
Aye. Aye.
All right, thank you. That motion passed.
Was Leanne's aye to be in favor, I assume?
Was that an aye or a, yes, that was a thumbs up.
Okay,
Those in favor?
okay.
Thank you, Leanne. With that, concludes our new business. Commission updates, Karen?
Yeah, just a couple things we have on the agenda tonight. Of course, the new year, it's the first meeting of the new year, to election of officers. So Brad, I think maybe you want to take that item and run with that, as you're the chair.
Do we pass it off to our recommending committee, or?
So Brad, you nominated a nominating committee to help you with that process.
Yes. Would the nominating committee like to report?
Take her away, Marty.
Okay. So Amanda and I are the nominating committee, and after exhaustive research and background checks on all these people, we'd like to nominate Brad Leeper to carry on as chair for the second year. And for vice chair, we'd like to, one of our more senior members, Dave Hartley, to take a turn at vice chair.
Senior.
Yes.
All of a sudden, I'm feeling old.
Do we need to vote on this, Karen?
Yeah.
Okay.
we need to vote on that.
All right, so is that a motion?
That would be a motion.
All right, and a second?
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed, same sign?
Aye.
Thank you, Leanne. Leanne was an aye as well. You have an update on meeting location.
And then second update is, as you know, City Hall is being remodeled, and this will be the last Planning and Zoning Commission meeting, last meeting in the council chambers. It'll be then torn up and remodeled. So the Planning and Zoning Commission will meet for the next, for the foreseeable future at the community center. The City Council will also be meeting at the community center, so just put that in your brain for next time to go to the community center, which is right next door to the library, of course.
Will we have all the same broadcast technology, everything
Yep,
there?
they're working on all that, so I haven't seen the final setup for how it's done, but we're all in this together. So, but yeah, it will be broadcast on Channel 15 and all the same processes and public availability to the meeting.
If you would be so kind as to send a reminder when you send out the next agenda in a couple
Sure.
of weeks, that would be really appreciated.
Yeah, sure, exactly.
Or flag us down as we arrive in the parking lot.
And get
Right.
there early to make sure you can find a place to park.
All right, thank you, Karen. If we made it through COVID, surely we can make it through a change for a few meetings. And with that, I would entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
All right, have a good night,
Aye.
everyone.